I was born into a family that didn't expect me, didn't want me, and didn't know what to do with me. My parents were in their early 40s when I came along, an unplanned addition to a life they already felt was full. They had a 10-year-old daughter, Jessica, who was the center of their world. From the moment I could understand words, my mother made it clear, "We didn't plan for you," she'd say in an offhand way, as if it were just a fact of life. I wasn't old enough to understand the depth of that statement, but the feeling it gave me lingered like a shadow. I often wondered if there was something wrong with me, something that made me unworthy of their attention. My grandparents, on the other hand, adored me, and it was only later in life that I learned they had persuaded my parents to have a second child. They hoped another child would bring joy to our family, but instead, it only seemed to widen the cracks. Jessica was everything my parents wanted. She was bright, outgoing, and ambitious, and they poured every ounce of energy into supporting her dreams. I was the quiet, unnoticed child in the background. Jessica wasn't cruel to me, she simply didn't see me. I was more like a fixture in her life, a little doll she occasionally acknowledged but mostly ignored. When I was young, I would sit in the corner of the living room, playing with my toys while Jessica lounged on the sofa, chatting with friends or preparing for her future. My parents hovered over her, reminding her about homework, packing her SAT materials, or helping her research colleges. I would wait patiently at the kitchen table, hoping someone would help me with my schoolwork. But the help rarely came. "You're old enough to figure it out yourself," my mother would say when I asked for assistance. From an early age, my days followed a predictable pattern. Each morning, my parents would drop me off at my grandparents' house. My grandparents became my safe haven, the only people who made me feel wanted. My grandmother cooked my favorite meals, helped me with homework, and tucked me in for naps on the living room couch. My grandfather would take me to the park, teach me arithmetic, and tell me stories about his childhood. "You're the best thing that ever happened to us," my grandmother would say, her hugs wrapping me in a warmth I never felt at home. But every evening, that warmth was stripped away when my father arrived to pick me up. "You wanted her," he'd joke bitterly to my grandfather, jingling his car keys. "She's all yours during the day." My parents would collect me, looking exhausted and a little annoyed, as if retrieving me was just another chore to tick off their list. I would climb into the back seat of their car, staring out the window, wishing I didn't have to leave. Back at home, my existence seemed like an afterthought. My parents were consumed by Jessica's accomplishments and future. My mother would gush about her daughter's potential, her voice brimming with pride as she told relatives about Jessica's top grades, her school awards, and her plans for college. "Your sister's going to do great things," my father would say. And I would sit quietly, hoping someone would notice me. When Jessica left for college, I dared to hope that things might change. Without her around, maybe my parents would finally see me. Maybe they'd appreciate me as the child who stayed behind. I couldn't have been more wrong. Instead of taking notice of me, they found new ways to make me useful. "The bathrooms need cleaning," my mother announced one afternoon as I returned from school. She handed me a bucket and mop, as though I'd been doing chores my whole life. By the time I turned 14, I had taken over most of the household responsibilities. I cooked, cleaned, and managed laundry. My evenings were spent scrubbing floors, folding clothes, and making dinner. My parents expected dinner to be ready when they came home from work, and if it wasn't, I heard about it. One evening, I overcooked spaghetti. My father poked at the noodles with his fork and said, "Tomorrow, try something with chicken." His tone made it clear it wasn't a suggestion. The only escape I had was my imagination. At night, after the dishes were done and my homework was completed, would sit on my bed with my laptop and browse college websites. I dreamed of strolling through sunlit campuses, surrounded by possibilities, free from the weight of my responsibilities at home. "One day, I'll leave this place," I told myself. "One day, I'll be free." When I turned 16, Jessica came back home, but not in the way anyone expected. She wasn't returning for a visit, she was bringing big news. She burst through the front door one afternoon, a tall, well-dressed man trailing behind her. "Mom, Dad," she announced, "this is Michael. We're engaged." It was as if someone had announced they'd won the lottery. My parents leapt to their feet, their faces alight with joy. "Oh, sweetheart," my mother exclaimed, pulling Jessica into a tight embrace. "We'll pay for everything. It's going to be perfect." My father was already on the phone, calling relatives to share the good news. Over the next several months, the house was consumed by wedding preparations. There were discussions about venues, guest lists, and flower arrangements. My mother and Jessica spent hours at designer boutiques, choosing the perfect dress. Every penny my parents had saved went toward ensuring that Jessica's wedding would be flawless. Meanwhile, I faded further into the background. I wasn't included in the plans, except when someone needed me to run errands or tidy up after a fitting. My grandparents attended the wedding, but they looked uncomfortable amid the extravagance. My grandfather stared solemnly at the champagne fountain, and my grandmother shook her head at the sight of an ice sculpture that probably cost more than a semester of college tuition. "They mean well," my grandmother said quietly. "But they've lost their sense of what's important." I nodded, but I couldn't bring myself to agree. 2 years after Jessica's wedding, I finally saw a glimmer of hope. I had worked tirelessly to earn top grades, and the effort paid off. I was accepted to 3 prestigious universities. I sat at the dinner table one evening, clutching the acceptance letters with trembling hands. "I got into all 3 schools I applied to," I said, my voice filled with excitement. My mother barely looked up from her plate. "That's nice," she said. "But," she continued, "we spent all our savings on Jessica's wedding, and took out loans. There's no money left for college." My heart sank. "But you paid for Jessica's tuition," I said softly. "That was different," my mom replied, her tone dismissive. "We thought she had potential." Her words felt like a punch to the gut. For years, I had worked hard to prove myself, hoping they would see me as more than just an afterthought. But now, their indifference was laid bare. My parents' words echoed in my mind as I sat in silence, clutching my acceptance letters. Their indifference stung, but it wasn't new. What was new, however, was the overwhelming sense of betrayal. After years of working hard to earn their approval, this was how they repaid me. That night, I called my grandmother, sobbing. She listened patiently as I poured out my frustrations, her quiet presence grounding me even as my emotions swirled. When I finally stopped speaking, my grandfather's voice broke the silence. "Ashley, we've been preparing for this," he said firmly. His words confused me. Preparing for what? My grandfather disappeared into his study and returned a few moments later with a folder. Inside were bank documents, savings plans, and a letter addressed to me. "We've been saving for your education since the day you were born," he said, his tone filled with quiet determination. "You can choose any school you want. You're covered." Tears welled up in my eyes as I looked at the documents. My grandparents, who had no obligation to do so, had been planning for my future all along. Their unwavering belief in me was a lifeline I didn't know I needed. That same night, I packed a small bag and moved in with them. My parents didn't try to stop me. My mother barely glanced up from the television when I told her. "Do whatever you think is best," she said, her voice void of emotion. Her indifference hurt, but it also set me free. College was everything I had imagined and more. For the first time in my life, I felt like I belonged. My professors recognized my potential, and I threw myself into my studies with a determination fueled by years of neglect. I chose to major in financial analysis. Watching my parents mismanage money my entire life had taught me the importance of planning, budgeting, and understanding the value of every dollar. My grandparents were with me every step of the way. They helped me move into my dorm, sent care packages filled with my favorite snacks, and called every week to check in. They were my biggest cheerleaders, their pride evident in every word of encouragement. "Ashley," my grandmother said during one of our weekly calls, "you're going to do great things. We always knew you would." Her words stayed with me, propelling me forward when the coursework became overwhelming. During my sophomore year, my grandmother called with news about Jessica. "Your sister and Michael are having a hard time," she said. "Michael can't hold down a job, and Jessica's career isn't going the way she'd hoped. They've been asking your parents for money." I wasn't surprised. Jessica had always relied on my parents to solve her problems, and they had always indulged her. But I couldn't help but feel a pang of bitterness. Where was this financial support when I needed it? Over the next year, things went from bad to worse for Jessica. Despite my parents' continued assistance, she and Michael couldn't keep up with their bills. Eventually, they moved back into my parents' house, into my old bedroom, no less. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Jessica's life unraveled, mine was finally falling into place. My professors were impressed with my work, and I was offered internships at top financial firms. I thrived in these roles, solving complex problems and earning the respect of my colleagues. "You have a natural talent for this," one of my supervisors told me during a performance review. "We'd love to see you back here after graduation." By the time I finished college, I had multiple job offers from prestigious companies. I accepted a position with a starting salary that was higher than I had ever dared to dream. My grandparents were overjoyed when I shared the news. "You've made us so proud, Ashley," my grandfather said, his voice thick with emotion. "We always knew you could do it." Not long after I started my career, my grandparents' health began to decline. First, my grandfather fell ill. He passed away quietly in his sleep, leaving a void in my life that felt impossible to fill. My grandmother, who had been his partner in everything, seemed to lose her spark. She passed away less than 2 months later. Their deaths hit me harder than I expected. They had been my rock, my safe haven, and the only family members who had truly loved me unconditionally. After the funeral, I stayed late to help with the arrangements. My parents, Jessica, and Michael hovered nearby, but their presence only reminded me of how different my relationship with my grandparents had been. As I was organizing some paperwork, my parents approached me. "Ashley," my mother began hesitantly, "about the inheritance." I turned to face her, my heart sinking. "What about it?" I asked. My father cleared his throat. "We were hoping you'd share it with us. You know, since we're family." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After years of treating me like an afterthought, they had the audacity to ask for money? "The inheritance is mine," I said firmly. "Grandma and Grandpa wanted me to have it, and I'm going to honor their wishes." Jessica stepped forward, her tone pleading. "But Ashley, the twins need a yard to play in. Don't you think they deserve a good home?" I stared at her, my anger simmering beneath the surface. "My answer is no," I said, turning to leave. Over the next few years, I focused on building a life that was truly mine. I purchased a small but cozy home, poured myself into my career, and found joy in the simple things. My parents and I barely spoke during this time. I didn't feel the need to maintain a relationship with people who had caused me so much pain. But then, years later, I received a call that changed everything. "Ashley," a relative said, "your parents are in a nursing home now. They're not doing well. You should visit." At first, I hesitated. Part of me wanted to ignore the call, to leave the past where it belonged. But another part of me, the part shaped by my grandparents' love and wisdom, knew that forgiveness was the only way forward. When I finally decided to visit my parents at the nursing home, I wasn't sure what to expect. The building was a stark, impersonal structure, with its beige walls and the faint scent of disinfectant hanging in the air. It was a far cry from the home my parents had always dreamed of owning, the one they'd never been able to manage financially. I entered their shared room hesitantly, my heart pounding in my chest. My mother sat in a recliner by the window, her once authoritative presence reduced to a frail figure with clouded eyes. My father, who had always carried himself with a sense of command, was hunched in a wheelchair, his thin hands trembling as they rested on the armrests. When they saw me, their faces lit up. "Ashley," my mother said, her voice quivering with emotion. "You came." I nodded, unsure of what to say. For a long moment, we simply looked at each other. My father broke the silence. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice raspy and weak. "It's been so long." At first, the visits were difficult. I felt a surge of conflicting emotions every time I stepped into that room, resentment for the years of neglect, pity for their current state, and a reluctant sense of duty to be there. I didn't know how to balance these feelings, so I started small. During my visits, I brought little things to brighten their days: a soft blanket for my mother, a book for my father, a few pictures of my house and the life I had built for myself. They seemed genuinely grateful, and as the weeks went by, they began to open up in ways they never had before. "I've been thinking about your grandparents a lot," my mother said one afternoon, staring out the window. "They were such good people. I wish I had listened to them more." Her words took me by surprise. My mother rarely admitted to being wrong, and this small moment of vulnerability made me pause. "You didn't see how much they gave," I said softly. She turned to look at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "No, I didn't. And I'm sorry, Ashley. I'm sorry for the way we treated you. You deserved better." That single sentence was a dam breaking. For years, I had dreamed of hearing those words, but in the moment, they didn't bring the overwhelming relief I thought they would. Instead, they left me feeling raw, as though the weight of all the years I had carried was suddenly exposed. "It's hard to forget," I admitted. "You didn't just ignore me, you made me feel like I didn't matter." My mother's tears spilled over, and her voice cracked as she spoke. "I know. I know we failed you. I don't even have an excuse. We were so focused on Jessica, so caught up in everything else, that we didn't see you. And by the time we realized it, we didn't know how to fix it." Her honesty caught me off guard. For the first time, I saw her not as the mother who had neglected me, but as a flawed human being who had made mistakes. As the weeks turned into months, my relationship with my parents began to shift. I wouldn't call it a transformation, but there was a quiet understanding that began to take root. I visited regularly, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. My father, once a man of few words, started to share stories about his childhood. "I used to want to be a musician," he admitted one day, chuckling. "But life has a way of steering you in other directions." My mother, who had always been stern and pragmatic, softened in her old age. She often spoke of the things she wished she had done differently. "I look at you now," she said one evening, "and I'm so proud of the person you've become. I wish I could take credit for it, but I know that's all you, and your grandparents, of course." I laughed softly. "They were my rock," I said. "And we were your storm," she added, her voice tinged with regret. "My father passed away first." I held his hand in the hospital, his grip weak but steady. His last words to me were, "Thank you, Ashley. Thank you for forgiving us." My mother's decline was slower, her health deteriorating over the next several months. By the time she passed, there was a peace between us that hadn't existed before. At her funeral, I stood by her graveside and reflected on the journey we had shared. It wasn't a perfect reconciliation, but it didn't need to be. She had apologized, and I had forgiven her, not because her actions were excusable, but because forgiveness had set me free. After my parents were gone, I focused on the life I had worked so hard to create. My career continued to thrive, and I found fulfillment in helping others manage their finances, a skill I had honed from a lifetime of learning what not to do. I eventually met someone who loved me for who I was, scars and all. Together, we built a life that was full of love and understanding. And yet, I often thought of my grandparents, their kindness, their belief in me, and the sacrifices they had made. They had given me the foundation to rise above my circumstances, and I honored their memory by living a life they would have been proud of. The story of my family wasn't one of picture-perfect happiness, but it was real. It was messy, painful, and imperfect. But it was mine. In the end, I found closure not because my parents changed, but because I did. I learned to forgive, not to erase the past, but to stop letting it define me. And as I stood in my own home, surrounded by love and the life I had built, I realized I had finally broken free from the shadow of my childhood. I was no longer the forgotten child. I was Ashley, and I mattered. Thank you for watching the video. Subscribe and turn on notifications to be the first to have radish and real stories with you. Have a great day.